Well, all right then. Welcome to the last of our 6 installments of Global Civics. As usual, we're going to have a kind of hopefully a fast-paced PowerPoint. We're going to take an intermission, and if time allows, I have something to show you during intermission. So it's kind of like an entertaining 10 minutes between my talk and your talk. So with that, we'll talk about, whoops. I don't know where I am. One more left? Okay. Global governance and civic engagement. As usual, a brief look back to where we've come from. The UN Declaration of Human Rights is foundational in much of the same way that the Declaration of Independence established the American identity. The United States has had a profound influence on the evolution of human rights laws and doctrine. To preserve its authority, America cannot exempt itself from standards largely of its own making. There's still no global COP or universal court to enforce human rights laws. Even though the international covenants are beyond our reach, the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Rights, that is Article 2 in the state constitution, are bulwarks of freedom. The still binding principle of state sovereignty creates a paradox for citizens struggling to achieve human rights. After all, it's the government that denies the very rights that citizens want to claim. If human rights is our destination, how do we get there? There are several tools and pathways available. We've talked about these. We can use non-governmental organizations to pressure governments with naming and shaming campaigns that rely on fact-finding, monitoring, and reporting using conventional and social media outlets as public platforms. We can pursue electoral strategies, choosing candidates who are serious advocates of human rights and eschewing negative campaign tactics. We can implement legal strategies in domestic and international courts, using the confidential complaints procedure to the UN Human Rights Committee and the Alien Tort Act in the United States, which we haven't really touched on much, but it enables the prosecution of foreign nationals in American courts for human rights crimes abroad. We can advocate for universal jurisdiction, as courageous judges in Spain and elsewhere have done. We can press Congress to ratify the Rome Statute and support the International Criminal Court. All in all, we need to make it more difficult for tyrants to abuse their citizens with impunity. But no matter which way we go, we've got to have heart, smarts, and courage. Western traditions rest on the concept of inherent natural rights as distinguished from government-issued rights. Civil and political rights are negative in that they protect individuals from government, and they can be immediately respected. Economic and social rights are positive and rely on progressive realization as conditions and resources of the state allow. There's an ideological schism between developed and developing countries. And it's widening. 90% of the world's population lives in emerging markets. To them, the obsession with political rights is misguided. Food, shelter, education, and health care are far more important to people earning $1 a day than defending democracy. A real challenge to Western ideals is emerging, the system embodied by China, which prioritizes economic rights, de-emphasizes democracy, and practices state capitalism. The China model is gaining prestige and momentum because it promises the fastest improvements in living standards in the shortest period of time. The Gini coefficient is a measure of income inequality. China's is improving, ours is getting worse. It's happily difficult to imagine a human rights empire, but we are aspiring to achieving governing systems that honor and support human rights. How best to circumvent or leapfrog, if not transform, these barriers? With respect to nationalism, we can celebrate and promote diverse populations with cosmopolitan points of view. Business can play a substantial and positive role. Multinational corporations with nationalistic moorings are morphing into transnational enterprises and global supply networks. One result is the dissemination of best practices, such as in fair compensation and in better health and safety standards. What can take the place of the sovereign state? The social disorder and chaos of failed states is not an attractive alternative. Federalism and subsidiarity offer ways to decentralize, and there are a variety of promising transnational regional approaches to economic and ecological challenges. Participants willingly forego some of the prerogatives of sovereignty in order to solve problems that transcend territorial boundaries. Associations of scientists, like the Intergovernmental Committee on Climate Change, are another example of transnational cooperation. Fundamentalism is a growing phenomenon in every major religion, including Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, and Islam. The cruelty and barbarism of Islamic State and Boko Haram, which translates as Western education is forbidden, boggles the mind. Fundamentalists fear secularism and its accompanying decadent materialist way of life. They want to retreat from the mainstream and find a place and space to be pure, or force everyone else to adopt their views. Still, religion is more a matter of identity than beliefs and practices. The Sunni-Shia split is rooted in tribal, political, and ethnic divisions. There are perennial efforts on the part of moderate mainstream religious organizations all over the world to come together, find common ground, and articulate messages to comfort and unite people rather than to make them fearful and divisive. The best antidote to bad religion is to offer a better one. Corruption is something we know a lot about in Montana, having suffered under the so-called copper collar well into the 20th century. Our forebears wrestled with the problem and crafted a new constitution and some good laws in response. At the national level, things are not going so well. The Congress seems to have been captured by the Wall Street-dominated financial oligarchy, which in effect owns and controls federal policies in the realm of health care, taxation, energy, and foreign policy. The military-industrial complex is thriving on the boundless and open-ended general war on terror. Moral hazard dominates big business and big government. In no other country do paid lobbyists exert so much influence over government. And it is hard to find an instance of the breakdown of democracy in which corruption did not play a leading or at least a prominent role. Now, while state governments lack sufficient authoritative autonomy and material resources to fully counteract the demise of accountable and responsible government at the federal level, they can still serve the nation by acting as laboratories of democracy. In the corner there is an index created by Transparency International, which I recommend to you as a source of information. Very sophisticated measures of corruption of all kinds across the board, across the world. Francis Fukuyama has a new book called Political Order and Political Decay. He's not pictured here. In it, he asserts that successful liberal democracies combine three essential elements: the state, rule of law, and accountability. Central authority is kept in check by a transparent system of laws and the will of the electorate. Balance is crucial in this setup because these elements can work at cross purposes. Americans obsessed with accountability have built a system of checks and balances so formidable that it paralyzes government, hence the term, his term, vetocracy. Larry Diamond, another author, that's his picture on the page, observes that we've been in a global democratic recession for a decade or so. In each of the past 8 years, Freedom House has found that the number of countries suffering declines in civil and political rights has outpaced those gaining in freedoms by more than 2 to 1. The reverse was true in the first 15 years following the end of the Cold War. Democratic breakdown is happening in big and strategically important states like Russia, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Venezuela, all of which operate in a gray zone between electoral democracy and electoral authoritarianism. Turkey, under Erdogan's leadership, has been drifting steadily in this direction and may have crossed a threshold. There's even talk of Turkey leaving NATO or being kicked out of NATO, and they seem to have given up on joining the European Union. And as you've seen, Pew and other polling organizations show a serious deterioration of trust here in the United States and elsewhere in government and other established institutions, including schools, hospitals, churches, and the media. The quote is from W.B. Yeats in a famous poem, The Second Coming. I won't read it to you because it won't sound as good as it needs to sound. Constitutions provide citizens with leverage as they engage in governance at all levels. The Montana State Constitution is probably the best in the West with respect to human rights. The reach is limited, but it provides one reason to be sympathetic and smart about states' rights. The U.S. Constitution is wanting in some categories and extremely difficult to change, but it's nevertheless a protection against depredations of the state. The International Bill of Rights. The Declaration, the main component of that, is a comprehensive articulation of values and principles, a verbal construct that no country voted against and no regime can openly denounce. The international covenants deserve U.S. ratification without the reservations and declarations and understandings that undercut Americans' ability to seek justice and demand accountability. Farther afield, we can bear witness and offer support to pro-democracy movements waging nonviolent campaigns to achieve or restore human rights. Gene Sharp, a well-respected but little-known American thinker, has become something of a godfather to resistance movements. On the Politics of Nonviolent Action, that's a book, plus Waging Nonviolent Struggle, he makes an important distinction between nonviolent conflict as a pragmatic combination of strategy and tactics and nonviolence as a moral principle and religious belief. You don't have to believe in nonviolence to wage nonviolent conflict. That's the main point. People are learning from Sharp and each other, demonstrating practical courage and using a variety of tools, such as occupation, boycott, and disinvestment in diverse settings, including the Chinese dissidents in Tiananmen Square, Otpor, an organization in Serbia that actually brought down Slobodan Milosevic sometime after the bombing campaign ended. The bombing of Serbia by NATO did not dislodge the regime. It's the Serbians themselves that brought them down through nonviolent action. And of course, more contemporarily, right now, we are witnessing the occupation. It's called the Occupy Central with Love and Peace in Hong Kong. Preventing genocide is imperative. Otherwise, we'll just continue to hear high officials lament their indecision and proclaim never again, again, and again, and again. We have to look beyond governments to get this done. Fred Cooney, one of his books is featured there, and others have crafted civilian-based strategies for survival. And I happen to bring, just to show, a volume entitled Locally Led Advanced Mobile Aid, the acronym is LLAMA, by a colleague of mine. It's an amazing compilation of practical information that civilians can use in the field to protect themselves when the government is either the enemy and the other government coming to save them is way too late. So there's a lot of information out there about how to resist tyranny and prevent genocide when the governments are failing to do the job. Now you'll see a horse on their picture. You might wonder, why is there a horse there? That's an Icelandic horse. It simply represents Iceland. Iceland is known for their uniquely hardy horses. Following massive social unrest resulting from Iceland's 2008 banking collapse, the political landscape changed drastically. Many officials left office, and the lack of political leadership dovetailed with a growing distrust of legislative leaders. Officials went straight to the people to rewrite the Constitution. In a 10-month process involving a 25-member Constitutional Advisory Council, it's going to culminate this month. It's the first ever crowdsourced Constitution. Just an example of innovation. Belgium's on the page there. Belgium is groundbreaking and recently modified assertions of universal jurisdiction. They're the pioneers of universal jurisdiction, reaching out across the world using their courts to bring perpetrators to justice in Belgium. In addition, while Flemings and Walloons are constantly considering divorce, along the lines of the Velvet Divorce that separated the Czechs from the Slovaks, the Belgian model of two nations sharing a state and an international city has resonance with the situation in Palestine. It's not just about human rights. Transnational cooperation is also essential to any serious attempt to deal with climate change and how to govern and manage the global commons, such as the oceans and outer space. The UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, which is depicted at the bottom of the screen, provides for the delineation of territorial waters and exclusive economic zones to prevent maritime conflicts and pollution. UN peacekeeping is a good example of innovation and cooperation in international efforts to fulfill the peace and security principles enshrined in the UN Charter and provide for post-conflict stabilization. Peacekeeping has unique strengths, including legitimacy and an ability to deploy and sustain troops and police from around the world, integrating them with civilian peacekeepers to advance multidimensional mandates. Today's peacekeeping operations are called upon not only to maintain peace and security, but also to facilitate the political process, protect civilians, assist in the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of former combatants, support the organization of elections, protect and promote human rights, and assist in restoring the rule of law. Peacekeeping can support a peace process. It is not a substitute for one. There have been 69 peacekeeping operations since the first one in 1948. There are 16 current operations, 9 of them in Africa. The UN forces in Cyprus have been there since 1964. Forces have been stationed on the border of India and Pakistan since 1949. The troops on the Golan Heights have been there since 1974. The UN does not have its own military forces. It relies on contributions from member states. The top contributors are Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Ethiopia, and Rwanda. Only the United States deploys more military personnel in the field in the world. There are about 120,000 currently in 16 separate operations. Peacekeeping is an impartial and widely accepted vehicle for effective action. The international character of Security Council authorized missions provides unparalleled legitimacy to any UN peace operation. Peacekeeping is relatively cheap. In the last year, $7.8 billion were expended, which amounts to 0.4% of global military spending. Our ambassador to the UN, Susan Rice, commented that if the U.S. were to act on its own in these complex emergency situations, for every dollar we'd spend, the UN can accomplish the mission for 12 cents. The big funders of UN peacekeeping are us at 28%, Japan at 11%, and then France, Germany, and the UK at about 8% each. To date, there have been mixed results in a wide variety of messy and complex emergencies. Success is never guaranteed because UN peacekeeping, almost by definition, goes to the most physically and politically difficult environments. Sometimes things go horribly wrong. There have been some debacles, from the spread of cholera in Haiti to sexual predation by peacekeepers in Africa, to the stunning display of collective cowardice at Srebrenica in Bosnia. The middle picture is actually a graveyard in Srebrenica. The fellow on the lower right is a Finn in Kosovo, where the UN maintains a peacekeeping operation even though the country is now independent. Once in a blue moon, things go wonderful. I say once in a blue helmet moon, things go wonderfully right, and I'm going to show you a short sample of that sometime during the break. The UN Charter outlaws the use or threat of military force to settle disputes between sovereign states. Chapter 7 collectivizes the legitimate use of force. The Security Council determines when and where a breach or a threat to international peace and security is occurring and authorizes sanctions and/or force. The Charter does acknowledge customary law and common sense. Countries can act in self-defense when it is necessary, unavoidable, and the threat is immediate. Humanitarian intervention messes things up considerably, as in the unauthorized NATO intervention in Kosovo, which has been characterized as illegal but legitimate. In an effort to overcome the weaknesses of peacekeeping, the unreliability of volunteered forces. At a 2005 World Summit, governments made an historic commitment to prevent and halt genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing when they unanimously agreed to the responsibility to protect, otherwise known as R2P. The main pillars of R2P are listed there on the page. Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the UN and head of the Peacekeeping Operations Office of the UN, is largely responsible for shepherding responsibility to protect as far as it's gone to date. The intervention in Libya by NATO was the first time that the United Nations Security Council invoked the R2P concept. The consequences were interesting, and today the situation is grim. International efforts to intervene in Syria, invoking the same principle, were stymied by Russia and China. They have veto power. R2P is in a bit of a pickle. According to an academic expert, and I quote, "No amount of debate over the doctrine or recent cases will resolve its status. It is both legal and illegal at the same time." And one of the interesting things about sovereign states is that they craft the law themselves. So in order to change the law, they break the law. That's one of the curious aspects of international law. It's made by states that violate their own strictures. The responsibility to protect is a natural outgrowth of past and present experiences with peacekeeping. It's also a radical concept, and it must be viewed in a larger context. Global governance is about fulfilling goals in support of human security. There is a movement afoot called human security to approach big questions of global governance within a human security framework. And just an aside about the primary objective of physical security, which is mostly about protecting citizens from violence. With increasing interdependence, and especially our dependence on the Internet of Things, analysts are worried about an electronic Pearl Harbor. We've talked about this in the past. Attacking a power grid or other sorts of financial industrial control systems is an example of asymmetrical warfare that could be hugely effective and damaging. The perpetrators of such an act could be Russia, China, Iran, Syria, North Korea, Al-Qaeda, or Hezbollah. It could be us, too, as the U.S.-Israeli joint effort to launch malware into Iran's subterfuges proves out. We're living with the specter of an interesting future. There are some almost unimaginable events on the horizon. That gives me pause and compels me to rethink just what sort of civic engagement is compelling. Global civics has been and continues to be mostly about information. The institutional machineries of human rights are fueled by reports, investigations, and documentation, mountains of documentation. We want accurate information. We rely on multiple sources. We can drown in information, or at least feel swamped. Sometimes it's necessary to just stop drinking it in and think. I read somewhere in an academic journal that thinking is research too. Engagement is rarely a solitary endeavor. A vital aspect of human security, I would assert, is good, honest relationships. States can fail. Systems can break down or be blown apart, and natural disasters on a global scale will happen. The best way to mitigate the damage is to establish relationships with other people. That's the basis of trust. There are organizations in our midst here in Montana that are committed to building trusting relationships across international borders. The terms international community are generally used to describe the world of sovereign states, but there is another type of community in ferment. It's us. As a secular-minded person, it's easy for me to discount or simply ignore the enormous significance of religious organizations and spiritual leaders in working towards global governance and the fulfillment of human rights. Faith-based charities are crucial to buttress and supplement government's efforts to bring human rights to the people. It's worth noting that basic concepts of justice, peace, and human rights arose from religious philosophers and doctrines, not from lab tests or science, technology, engineering, and math courses. Pictured here is the Aga Khan, the Dalai Lama, Pope John Paul II, and a group of notable leaders called the Elders. The Aga Khan is the hereditary imam of the Ismaili sect of Shia Muslims. Very generous, philanthropic, supports education all over the Muslim world. The Elders, which you'll recognize some of them, are a global group of independent leaders who work together for peace and human rights. They no longer hold public office and are beholden to no vested interest. Kofi Annan is the current chair. This group came about in 2007 as a consequence of Branson, the Virgin Airlines executive, and Peter Gabriel, a world musician. They got together and started talking about the role that elders play in traditional societies as founts of wisdom. So the consequence of all that is this group dedicated to peace and human rights. It includes Jimmy Carter. Some folks have died of late, but an interesting organization to look up. That leads us to some quotes for you to ponder. And I'm not going to ask you any questions this time, because you're going to come up with some of your own. So we'll leave that on the screen for a few moments, and then we'll take our short break, during which time I have an 8-minute video to show you. So in a couple of minutes, we'll launch that. And after that, we'll have you up to the table as usual to discuss any of this that you'd like. I mentioned that once in a blue helmet moon, something wonderful happens in the realm of peacekeeping. And this is a brief segment of a larger piece that documents one of the brighter moments in the history of United Nations peacekeeping. So we'll launch it.
since 1993. Since then, we've rotated 10 task forces similar to mine through here. Throughout the last rotation, we were capped at 500 soldiers per task force. And as you know, there's another battalion just to our west. It's a Nordic battalion from with a Finnish colonel in charge.
We are the first and only peacekeeping operation so far in the history of the United Nations that has the task of preventing a conflict before it has erupted. If you take the other countries of the former Yugoslavia, you will see that international presence has been introduced while the conflict lasted or after it has ended. And this is a different kind of work than what we are pursuing. So since we are somewhat experimental, we call ourselves a laboratory of preventive action.
The types of things that we routinely see out here are patrols from both sides. We are neutral observers. The UN was invited in by Macedonia, so we report what we see on the ground, and we report it directly through the United Nations channels. They report in turn to the United Nations in New York. So I think what you'll see is a professional force is trained for the mission, and I think you'll be impressed with what you see here.
I appreciate the job you guys did yesterday with the ADC. Very impressed with how you're conducting operations on this OP in particular. And of course, you've made a number of changes out here, even since I've been out here midweek, that I think we're moving in the right direction. So just tell you, keep up the good work. I hope you get some sunshine this week. I know this rain's got you anyway. So.
Why are we in Macedonia? This country has nothing to offer us. Zero. Zip.
We didn't just jump in here and intervene. They ask us to be here.
Right.
I think they ask us to be here to protect them from somebody who's being a bully at this time.
We let it escalate, it'll end up in Europe. And we have very strong interests in Europe. You got to look at it. European economy and the American economy are locked hand in hand.
But you know what? Everywhere where the U.S. goes, you can't say this is not true. Everywhere where the U.S. goes, they see us, and we are like a shot, their first shot of heroin. You know, they see us, and it just makes them feel all high. And they get addicted to what they consider our way of life, and that's what they want.
But if we don't do anything and step in and to prevent it from blowing up, down the road is a heavy price. You might think, well, this is not America's problem. It's the world's problems.
The U.S. cannot be in isolation in this country. Our economy, you know what makes us as strong as we are? Our economy, the almighty dollar.
But you know what? Our almighty dollar, as far as the rest of the world goes, I don't care if you pull everybody else back. I'm sorry, they all have the little taste of heroin, and they all want to be American. You've seen it just like me, rolling down into the Macedonian shops. You got little Macedonian kids want to flip you off and whatever else. You're rolling down to the Macedonian shop, but you know what? They all got Nike and Florida State on. Never been to Florida? No. I want to be American. Look at me, I look American.
You gotta look at it as you are the leadership of what's the end of the Cold War. They're looking at you for, hey, you're the guys that will take us into the next millennium. Help us out.
What is our mission here? Our mission here is to observe, monitor, and report. We are in no way helping their military out. All we are doing here is standing up on a hill and making sure that their brothers right across the border don't walk across.
I don't think we're just standing here. I think what it is, again, going back to the flag, it's a deterrent. That because they know the deal, that if they come across and try to drag us in, it's going to be a heavy price to pay.
There is a part two, but we'll save it for another time. I don't want to steal away any of your discussion time. At any rate, just to reiterate, that was a one-time only mission. There's never been another preventive deployment. It ended shortly after this was finished as a consequence of China vetoing the continuation of this mission. Why? Because Taiwan gave money to the government of Macedonia. So it had nothing to do with the mission itself. It had everything to do with the politics of recognition and China's relationship with Taiwan. The other unique aspect of this, it was called UNPRODEP, the UN Preventive Deployment, was it was the first and only time that American soldiers have been under a UN flag. And they had a very complicated arrangement, which was barely alluded to in some of the discussion, but it did work. It hasn't been tried again. So just an illustration of peacekeeping at its best, short-lived, complicated, effective, and worthy of another try. One thing to remind you of about UN peacekeeping is the Security Council doesn't send troops into a country without that country's permission. In other words, sovereignty is respected. In this case, the government of Macedonia invited this mission, and the UN obliged. And that's generally the case. One of the key problems with UN peacekeeping operations is because they're based on voluntary contributions of troops from a whole range of countries, they're slow to move, they're cumbersome, and oftentimes the situation requires swift, speedy action. There is no rapid deployment force available to the UN. Thus, we have the R2P initiative, which legalizes swift action as long as it's authorized by the UN Security Council. So with all that, I invite you back up to the table to talk about global governance and civic engagement in any way you'd like to. And let me know if you need any additional break time, but if you're ready, we're ready. Who would like to start? I think our history professor is not ready to start.
Our history professor is not ready to start.
Mr. Driscoll.
Well, I put my media log over here, but I neglected to include into it Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is about quality. And one of the themes in the book by Robert Pirsig is, if you want quality, if you want something done right, you first have to care. And one of the things that's kind of between the lines in the present situation is a lot of people really don't care anymore. So, as much as I would like to say that civic engagement is probably a good step for all of us, caring is a good first step. And I'm not sure how you break that nut. But you can see we're just a small number of people who care can make a huge difference. And of late, I've been interviewing old broken down smoke jumpers. I used to be one. I am an old broken down one. And there was 80, probably 102 smoke jumpers who were used by the CIA in some of its clandestine operations. Over in Africa, over in Iran, down in Peru and South America, and lots over in Laos and Cambodia and South Vietnam, and helping getting the Dalai Lama out of Tibet. And in the Bay of Pigs, down in Guatemala, all over the place. It's unbelievable. But it's really remarkable as I read some of the notes that are available to see now what they actually did, how much courage that a lot of them had. But what I really appreciate is there are a lot of them from Montana and Idaho, is they had real heart. And so when the U.S. pulled the plug, as it tends to do, and wanted us to bail out of Vietnam after a long time, and 12 years in Laos, next door, the war there started earlier as an economy of force operation. Some of the smoke jumpers who by then were CIA case officers, they stayed on. You know, they stayed when the last Hmong tribes people were just getting slaughtered by the Pathet Lao. They stayed there, and they fought alongside of them, and then they found ways after they were pulled out to get them safely out of Laos, where they were a pariah. The Pathet Lao were killing them left and right. They couldn't get them all out, but they helped get quite a few of them out. And that's why we have such good farm products at our farmers market, is we got so many Hmong neighbors. And but it goes back to a couple people really caring. And if you talk to the Hmong, they'll tell you who those people were. They're cowboys from Montana, Idaho. And so I think caring is huge. And then the civic engagement is really about what you care for. And we could talk about that. I probably should talk about that later. But I'm really concerned about the lack of caring right now.
It's interesting that John would say that, because I have a couple things I want to mention that I think are even more than tangentially related. One, the Dalai Lama's book, The Art of Happiness, talks about the power of compassion. And that's that question of caring. And he said that indeed, in fact, that is true happiness, that compassion is true happiness. And that the only way to go forward in the world is to think about compassion. And that got me thinking about what stands in the way of compassion. And then I was listening to that young man speak about how everyone wants to be an American, and that's just not true. You go places, not everyone wants to be an American. They want jerseys from Florida State University because, for the same reason that I want scarves made by Druze tribes people on the Golan Heights, because it's cool and it's different and it's and that's why they want these things. So, and I think that idea and approaching the rest of the world with that idea that everyone wants to be us stands in the way of all the good that we might do. Because even if you say, I don't show that to people when I go out, you can see it on the faces of people when they travel. So if we want to talk about what's important going forward, I think we need to think about what are some of the barriers to civic engagement and to global governance. And one of them is a lack of caring, a lack of compassion, and how do we deal with that? Realizing that not everyone wants to be us, and that's a good thing. I mean, heaven forbid, what a boring place would the world be. And then the other thing I really object to is the way that we approach some of the problems in the world. And I'm going to pick on religious extremism because it's something I know a bit about. My frustration lies in the failure to look at what are the underlying causes, and it has nothing to do with religion. They probably don't know a great deal about their religion. It packs an emotional punch, to be sure, but I think we have to look at what are the underlying causes of frustration and anger and poverty and a group of educated people who have no hope of getting a job. I mean, there are systemic problems that we seem very inclined to ignore. So, there we go for now.
I guess I would say I agree with what both of you said. You know, my background is being involved in social movements. I grew up in the late 60s, early 70s. I come out of the women's movement and the anti-nuclear movement. And I think one of the things is really where people feel like they can make a difference, that you actually have the ability to change the status quo. And one of the concerns I have about globalization is that when we talk about other countries and issues that we don't know very much about, that it seems so complicated that we give up, you know, or even like climate change. It's like, oh my God, it's such a huge issue. There's nothing to be done about it. You just give up. And when you start giving up on what you're able to control in your own life or or work towards the common good, then it's just really a slippery slope. And so that sense of social movements where it's like, I'm working with a set of people that have the same values, that want the same end, and then you can really accomplish a lot with, without tons of resources. One of the concerns I have is that it seems to me that sort of our government has stopped caring, so that a government was supposed to, promote and protect the common good. And so it was seen not that long ago that it was the government's role to have a war on poverty. If you took that to this Congress or the incoming Congress about we want to have a war on poverty, what you'd hear is it is not government's responsibility to help poor people. We've shifted in our own scope of what's possible, and I think we're not able to really take big ideas or big problems and think that we can solve them anymore.
Well, I too appreciate greatly bringing caring to the forefront of this conversation. My struggle has been, I want people to care about international law. I want them to care about global governance. Well, that's not easy to do, and things do seem so far away, so distant, so abstract, and out of scale that it's hard. And so that's why I'm struggling with, there's so much information about this. There's so much learning to be had. The internet makes it so easy to learn about, through information, what this is all about. But that's a brain-oriented activity, and without an emotional component to it, it doesn't go very far. Thus, I'm kind of retreating into, okay, in order to make people, in order for me to care, I have to have direct engagement with real people, Macedonians or whomever who comes to this country and visits Montana. That's a direct connection. It sort of creates that emotional link to, international law, human rights means a lot to these people that are visiting Montana from all over the Middle East, young people. We have, lots of minute-long clips, just a minute for human rights, where they just say what's on their mind. It's fantastic. So I'm kind of rambling around, but one of the ways I'm learning to make progress toward having people share with me the care for these big things is to sort of keep bringing it home. In other words, international law is just a manifestation of this basic principle of the rule of law. Well, do you care about that? Well, yeah, sorta. Well, what about the Montana Constitution? What a wonderful example of the rule of law crafted by ordinary citizens, following decades of corruption. So all of these things in this global civics approach, it's an attempt to find ways to unleash that caring, whatever it is, instinct or capacity that I know people have. But as Terry said, some of these things are so far out there that it's difficult for people to cling to them and continue to care unless they have a direct emotional connection. And then just one more thing that's on my mind is, I forgot to insert it into a slide, but when I look out at the world and we're witnessing all of these revolts, middle-class revolts in so many countries, and to me it's the root of all that is it's humiliation. People don't like to be humiliated, like with unemployment, bad health, lack of education. It's this constant wellspring of humiliation foisted upon large numbers of people by governments who don't care. And so the response is either a violent reaction or the really intelligent, successful ones use nonviolent strategy and tactics to win to get back some self-respect and self-determination. So that's kind of a mishmash of things, but it all started with this notion of, well, who cares, and if they're not caring, why not? And how can we proliferate caring amongst ourselves.
I think that I'm a real big believer in nonviolent ways of doing things, and I have great admiration for people who have actually done those sorts of things. Working in politics is a nonviolent way of making change, for sure, that we've been given that system here in this country, in this state. This takes a lot of courage to do things that way. But the truth is that when you get involved in civic engagement, you're really involved in politics, whether you like it or not, of one kind or another. And as near as I can tell, it really is true that war is an extension of politics. At some point, no more Mr. Nice Guy. It's over with. The gloves come off and people start dying like flies. And I remember before some deployments, just this realization like, oh my God, do I got to go do this? And then I remember thinking, well, if there's going to be a victim in this little picture, it isn't going to be me. You know, basically you get down to that stuff. And I think that I really favor, if a policymaker has a nonviolent option, they should use it. Try it first. But I would and I don't like to go to movies that have a lot of violence in them, gratuitous violence. I don't like to go to movies that are horror movies. I never go to them. I don't like them. I think they're a waste of time. Sorry, but I do. I don't understand that. But the other day I went to a movie that I was interested in because I used to be a tank company commander. I had my own armor company, 17 tanks, and it's about an armor unit, a tank crew. And it just came out, and it's called Fury, and Brad Pitt's the director. And I wanted to see how they did the crew operations in there, and I was just kind of interested in that because I used to train people to do that and do it myself. And it's a great anti-war movie. But I'll tell you what, if you ever want to step out of your comfort zone, and we all have our comfort zones, and do something. I didn't like to see Whoopi Goldberg in The Color Purple. I hate seeing people get hurt. I mean, I'm just that kind of person. It just makes me uncomfortable. But that movie, Fury, in my mind, was worth seeing, stepping outside your comfort zone and be rattled. Because you start to appreciate what our mothers and fathers went through in the Second World War to give us a lot of the things that we take for granted. You know, the Bretton Woods conference, for example, that makes our currency a reserve currency that allows all these shenanigans to be played by an irresponsible Congress, and we can still live in comfort while everybody else really does have to balance their budget. We just print a lot of money. And the UN, which you've been discussing, and all the peace operations that come from that, all that came out of the war. And it's kind of like we've overstayed we've lived off of that for a long time now, and I'm wondering when that's going to come to an end. And it would be really good for people to at least understand how severely awful that war really was. The killing was just unbelievable that those people had to go through on both sides. And in the very end, without giving away the punchline, it came down to civic engagement, whether or not that tank crew was going to commit itself, engage itself for reasons that had to do with caring. And they're a lot, and they're just the pickup crew you might find on a city street corner, you know, every kind. None of them are brainiacs, and they're just regular U.S. GIs. And then you start to appreciate really what it takes just to have what we have now, let alone keep it. And that's civic engagement also, but it's violent. And I have to say that I think we need to be prepared to do that when we're espousing a lot of ideas. If you're willing to die for them, then go for it.
Okay, I want to just maybe step back for just a second, and because I think that in all of my classes when we talk about what can I do, and we send students abroad and they like to hear about some of the things that I've done. A number of years ago, the reading for the first-year student seminar at Carroll was Paul Farmer's Mountains Beyond Mountains, and it's a wonderful book, and he talks about the tremendous things that he has done in Haiti and elsewhere. And about halfway through the book, the students sort of looked at me and said, this is so great, and he can do all of these wonderful things, but I'm just one person. And what can I do? And I think that raises a really interesting question about what can all of us do as one person. And I had I said, well, why don't you read a little bit further? You might find an answer to your question if you just read a little bit further. And sure enough, later on, he talks about it's not about the big things that you do. It's about doing what you can at that moment when you are the most needed. So it's not about making a big splashy impact. It's about who's that one person that you can help. And maybe that one person you helped will help 5 other people. It's and I'm going to paraphrase it poorly, so I apologize to all who know it better. But there's a very short passage in the Torah that talks about whoever saves one life saves the entire world. And I think when we think about things like global government and civic engagement, we start somewhere that looks a little bit more manageable. My first-year students right now are volunteering at places like God's Love and the food bank. It's the one that's their civic engagement right now. They can make a difference for that small group of people. So maybe when we're thinking about the big things and we're thinking about the UN, maybe we start to think about, the advice of Paul Farmer, help who you can. Do what you can in that moment. Don't turn away.
I agree too. I think that, each individual has to do their part, help people, who are suffering, etc. But I do think that that's also a downstream approach, that you can just put a bunch of money into, there will always then be people who are poor. So we have to also look for solutions that are upstream and say, what is causing poverty and what can we do to change those laws or those conditions that keep people in this continuing state. I really think for me, Stephen, you and I are different in that I am not interested, or I guess not knowledgeable about laws, and that the way I become interested in them is how I perceive they affect me or how I perceive they affect other people. And so we make, I think, or do ourselves and others a disservice when we're not able to talk about the values behind laws, the values both good and bad, because really public policy doesn't motivate people. It's like, what are the values behind that public policy? That's what actually motivates people to do good and to do bad. And so, I really agree that we have to do both things. We have to start small, because small changes lead to bigger things, but we also can't be afraid of some of the big issues that are affecting the world as we know it, because if we don't engage on that level, there are other people who are engaging. They are, that somebody's values are going to win the day on, say, violence in the world, climate change, etc. Those things are not just happening by happenstance. Those are policies that are being made, and they reflect a set of values.
Well, at this point, I want to reiterate an open invitation to anyone else here this evening who has a comment. That includes staff behind cameras who have been steadfast in doing the chore they're assigned to, but they're welcome to comment as well. I certainly can't disagree with the fact that laws are a manifestation of values, and it perturbs me, or it astounds me to realize that we have a lot of bad laws on the books, or laws that permit certain interest groups to have their way every day and get rich by the minute. And it's like, well, how can that be? Why do people hold those values? It perplexes me. I don't know where that comes from. I'm not naive about just natural greed and things like that, but it goes beyond base virtue and vice. There's something else, ideologies that actually perpetuate bad laws, and legal corruption, another perturbing fact of our time. We're facing a lot of corruption that's totally legal. And how do you beat that in a nonviolent strategy other than politically, using the process, and the process is in so many ways it's rigged against major reform of that kind. And John, I don't have the benefit or the burden of your experience with violent situations, but I do actually agree, and I respect the need from time to time to act violently and efficiently and massively to protect life and limb and resources and that sort of thing. And I just wanted to kind of backtrack also to the whole concept of nonviolent action. It isn't rooted in the philosophy of nonviolence. It's not Gandhi-esque or anything like that. It's not even Christian or, it's not religion. It's really somebody's attempt to come up with measures that citizens can take when they're so weak. They don't have the resources available to wage effective, violent revolution. So what's the next best thing? It's being really, really crafty, using social media now, using organizational techniques, military ideas, absent the weapons that would go with them. And that's what I find so remarkably interesting and encouraging about nonviolent action campaigns in other countries, especially in countries where there's brutal dictatorships, and somehow they're overcome because the dictators are up against something they don't even understand, and that is the popular sovereignty. I mean, the will of the people will have its way, one way or another. You can't kill everybody and still have a claim to fame. So I'm especially enamored with what happened in Serbia, bringing down the dictator Slobodan Milosevic, who died, but otherwise he was going to be prosecuted, never persecuted, at the International Criminal Court. So justice was working. And it's also encouraging to know that their tactics, their organizational structures were born of a New England intellectual's books on the subject, an academic who kind of had this figured out. So since we've talked a little bit about movies, I would recommend that one to you in use in class. It's called Bringing Down a Dictator, and it sort of explains in great detail how this came about. So that's what I have to offer at the moment.
I would also add that, because if we can avoid killing each other, I think that's good. I think we should do that wherever possible. But I also think that part of civic engagement is where we've seen things break down in large parts of the world is because who's not invited to the table. And we may not like them, not we, but the United States or the other people or whoever they are, we may not like certain groups, but the minute that you don't invite everyone to the table, there's a problem. And you don't have to approve of their tactics, you don't have to even approve of what they stand for, but the minute that you marginalize them, the minute that they are excluded from that civic conversation, even in some of the most violent places in the world, it is a recipe for their violent response. And so I don't know why people don't understand that, but I think it's a really important point to make that civic engagement doesn't just involve people that we like and people that we admire and people that we think are really great and are doing a really sort of spectacular job about leading. It's about including people that we might find some of their views reprehensible, but we invite them to have the conversation and we invite them into the community in the hope of trying to change that, rather than giving them an outlet and a reason to fight back in a way that's violent. So I think that's the other side of that civic engagement question is it means everybody.
The thing that brings to mind is, for me, is back when Montana was still a territory and all the tribes were being pushed back up against the Rocky Mountains. I mean, the Sioux were back coming up the Yellowstone and the Missouri and killing settlers left and right. The Blackfeet were active and they were all busy, but they were in a diminished area with a diminishing resource, less buffalo. And then Thomas Marr comes and he has to go up right away to help work out a peace treaty that's already been determined by our U.S. Department of Interior what it's going to be, whether the Indians like it or not. And one of the first things he noticed is some of the important chiefs were not at the table. The people were signing for him, but they just weren't there. They were back up, and after they massacred the woodcutters on the Marias, they just headed back up to Canada where they came from. But they should have been there, and he knew that right away. And I think what you've said is really true. It's an absolute recipe. It's a waste of time if you don't have everybody at the table.
Well, you're reminding me of something much more, in our midst today, and knowing you have legislative experience here in Montana, and we're all witnesses to the Montana legislative process. And something I greatly admire about that is the inclusiveness that goes with our process here in this little state, with open meeting laws, with televised proceedings. Every day when those legislators come together to make policies good and bad, there are characters from all over the state, and nobody is shut down completely. I mean, absent things at the margin that I'm not aware of, it's an open government process, and lots of harsh realities are brought to light. A lot of unsavory people, in my view, people that I wouldn't want to have lunch with or run into, there they are speaking their minds, and I'm amazed at how important that is, and that's a process that does produce good results, because even in really contentious situations, and the state is in the midst of one, over water and tribal claims to water and historic treaties. I mean, it's a fascinating microcosm of international relations within North America, within Montana. And there's an awful lot of people with an awful lot of misinformation and a lot of people with information, and they all come together and hash it out. They're hashing it out. And something good will probably come of it, because nobody wants to spend the rest of their lives in court, losing in court. So there's a lot of stuff that goes with that story, but your theme of inclusiveness, I agree, is so important. And here in this state, with our Constitution and our customs, a lot of people are not excluded. They might think they are, but they're not. They can come and speak their minds, and the legislature will listen to them. And the citizens of the state will hear that, like it or not. It's a bit of an aside from our topic, but somehow everything mixes together.
And we should hear what we don't want.
So this may really show me to be, on the whatever kind of downhill side of the, or date myself or whatever the thing may be. But one of the concerns I have is that opinion now can be taken as fact, so that people don't. It's almost with having so much information that you can look and find information to support whatever argument you have. And, I'll use the example again. It's like someone could say, there are X thousand hungry children in Montana. And then say a legislator will come up and say, well, I just read a study from, blah, 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 Heritage Institute, which says childhood hunger is a myth, and there really aren't any hungry children in Montana, and and state that as fact, rather than and opinion is not fact. That either something is or it isn't, and we are having a really hard time. At least, I think it's fine for someone to say there are X number of hungry children. I don't think it's the government's role to feed them. That's different than saying they don't exist or that problem doesn't exist. That's where I think people start to disengage, where they can't get a handle on reality, because nobody is giving you a very consistent vision of reality, even if their views on it are different. So it's hard to get civically engaged, because again, people don't want to make an uninformed choice. They don't want to do something that ends up being dumb, and so when you can't get a handle on what is really the issue here and what could we do about it, it leaves a lot of people out of the process.
I think you're right on. That's one of my. That's part of caring, is getting the facts right. There's a whole. I guess it's a period in life people go through, or I don't know. It's a place on the political spectrum. I don't know what it is. I call it the school of fish syndrome, where it's like, well, how do we think about this now? And they go this way. And how do we think about it? And then they go this way. And it's frustrating because they really need to think for themselves based on the facts. And right now, I'm finding that I feel that way about the discussion about global climate change. I got some pretty fair environmental commercial credentials that I earned the hard way years ago. But I also know a little bit about the electricity system, and I don't think people know what dispatchability is in power plants. And to have solar panels, which is what we have on our house, you have to have part of the system dispatchable. You know, big baseload plants, like coal strip, and or nuclear plants. You know, take your pick. But the plants that we have are extremely inefficient. They're only 30% efficient on average, and now the EPA wants to get them up to about 37% efficiency. Well, and people are going to argue about that, but actually they should be at 48% efficiency. They can be if they were the available technology. I'll just leave it at that. Yet nobody's talking about those nuances, because the curves that contribute to global climate change, emissions curves, they flatten out significantly if you change our fleet of 1,400 power plants to 48% efficient power plants instead of 30% efficient. Yet nobody's talking about that. They just want to shut down the plants. But then where's the dispatchability that they're going to be screaming for when the lights go out? And that kind of discussion has to take place. And we could here in Montana be in a great position to say, yeah, you can come and have our coal, but you can have it for 48% efficient power plants in China. That would be a huge, huge stick to use internationally if we would just sit down and talk with the facts and listen to each other.
Well, you know, back to caring and distinguishing facts from opinion. I mean, we've probably all heard some recent radio reports about studies about media literacy and media use, the use that citizens make of the media available to them. And at the beginning of this series, you know, I kind of invited folks to keep a journal, a media log. You know, where do we get our information? And I'm confident that everybody in this room accesses diverse sources of information because they care to. They want to distinguish facts from opinion and get multiple sides of an issue in their heads so they can discern for themselves what's the most reasonable approach that I want to take. Well, unfortunately, that's not commonplace, or it's less common than I would hope, because the studies that people are doing through polling and all that indicate that just like our country has become more and more split along ideological lines, most of that is fed and fueled by the politicization of the media. And it's all sides doing this, both sides, if you can call it that. And people increasingly gravitate to a single source of news about the world in particular. I mean, world news, they go to one source and treat anything they see and hear on that one source as the truth, as the factual truth. And we know that can't be. You know, nobody has that exclusive hold on it, and more networks, cable networks, radio networks, they're even unabashedly opinionating the news. I mean, they don't even make excuses or apologies for it anymore. Oh yeah, that's a given. And then they insult our historical intelligence by saying, well, that's the way it's always been. And, you know, if you look back to the fervent of the revolutionary period and the post-revolution, you know, way back in American history, all the rags were bent. I mean, no one was a fair, honest, fact-oriented journalist. You know, as if there's no difference in the media 250, 300 years ago and how powerful the media is today. So I find it really disturbing and challenging. I haven't got an answer to how to do this other than to assiduously assert, the care to obtain information, news, facts from as many sources as you can take. And then, once again, it's easy to fall into the trap of getting too much information and then not knowing what to do, being just sort of paralyzed by the weight of data and conflicting facts and opinions. That's a challenge too, and that's where it helps to just stop and think about something else.
And I think it's really, it's very easy. I have my sources that I trust and that I like and that I enjoy the reporting, and I think that it's pretty good, and I read around, and I read several languages, so I try to read around. But from time to time, I find I have to tell myself, I have to listen to the sources that I consider the enemy. And that's very painful for me, and I don't want to, and I resist, and I get kind of all worked up in the morning when I think this is my morning when I have to do that. But I think it's really, really instructive to make sure that we get information not from those places that we think are going to affirm or confirm what we believe, but to sort of go out there and say, I know that I'm going to be very frustrated, but it's really important to hear what are those other voices. Because it's like inviting those people to the table that I might agree or disagree with. It's like inviting that media into the realm of what I think I have to consider. And you're right, it's daunting. And sometimes it's exhausting to do that. But I think it's really, really important to think about not just what we agree with and those that we like, but where do we disagree? Where is the tension? Who's on the margins? What's the boundaries, right? And try to find a way to sort of move beyond those.
One other thing I saw a number of years ago, the Dalai Lama was on the Today Show. So again, that sort of shows the my media source is a bit kind of in the not high level news reporting, but I was happy that the Dalai Lama was on the Today Show, and he was asked, is he really concerned about the state of the world, and doesn't he get depressed about what's going on? And he said, and again, I will not be as eloquent as he was, but he said, if it's a problem that I think there's something that I can do, then I don't worry, because I can do something about it. If it's something I don't think, that I can't do anything, then I don't worry, because I can't do anything about it. And he was asked that he feels that the world is actually, that things are going better than, they're turning towards the good. And when I often have to just remind myself of that, because if I get into that place of fear and constriction and that everything is bad, then again, that's just such it doesn't motivate you to be civically engaged. I mean, I think there has to be some sense of moral outrage of injustice or whatever that can compel you forward, but you still have to believe that things can be better and that people working together can make the world a better place. Otherwise, it's just too fatalistic. And I do think, as you put, the enemy really wants us to be afraid, wants us to be constricted, wants it to feel like it's too complicated, and you might as well just, stay home, or kind of, the world's too scary a place to engage with, and then we'll lose, So that's a reminder I have to say to myself several times a week, I think.
As always, I hate to interject or interfere with, and you're going to have a word.
I saw a bumper sticker several years ago that said, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. I think we should all have one of those. I want one really badly.
Well, this is our last gathering, and you're not going to get away from here without one more quiz. So I hope you're ready. It's multiple, not multiple choice, but number questions. Take a look. And when people are ready, we'll take a look at the answers. But, of course, you're being invited to blurt them out as they come to you.
Well, the permanent members, I believe, are still Russia, China,
The U.S.
U.S., Britain, France. That's 5.
That's correct.
Britain and France.
And since you know that, what is it that distinguishes those 5 countries that have such legal authority? In other words, they define what is legitimate use of force in law. What is it about them? Why those 5?
No, you mean their veto power?
Yeah. Why? Well, yeah. Why do those particular countries have veto power?
Well, they were the ones that had the people in the tanks that killed more of the other people were in tanks too, and they won.
Yeah. So they the victors.
They were the victors. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Well,
they're kind of living on their laurels, I'd say.
right. I was going to point out that as we've learned, there are a number of other countries with far larger economies, far larger militaries, far larger stakes in the world that that covet that kind of power or want the permanent 5 to lose their veto power. So it's a bit of an anachronistic system, and it's becoming delegitimized by just the growth of other countries and the ambition of other countries. The other thing that those 5 have is something in the military realm.
All 5 are nuclear powers.
Yeah.
They're 5 of the 11, I guess.
Yeah. So they are all nuclear weapons powers. How about the 3 largest Muslim countries by population?
The largest is Indonesia.
That's correct. Indonesia is number 1.
Is number 1.
You want
I'd
to?
say the next most populous would be Egypt, right?
He's guessing Egypt, but he's going to be found wrong. Okay, well, we're walking through the 5 flags to a very interesting map. So if you hang on the right-hand side,
India?
No, it's Pakistan is second.
Yeah, but India might be third.
And, right, I think
yeah.
India is third.
So the top 3 are Indonesia, Pakistan, and India, which was a bit of a surprise in that, India is not thought of, generally speaking, as an Islamic country. After all, the split of British India into 2 countries was supposed to establish a Muslim state and a Hindu state, and yet there are still 161 million Muslims in India.
Yeah, many of them didn't move.
Right. Yeah. And, going back to the peacekeeping thing, there's a UN peacekeeping deployment on the border between India and Pakistan and Kashmir, and it's been there since 1949.
Yeah, it has. And they still take shots at each other from time to time.
Okay. Last one was, where'd that happiness index come from?
Is that
Bhutan.
They're Brunei.
No, you got it right. Bhutan.
Yay, Rob.
Tiny little
Rob,
kingdom
be something. That's fabulous.
sequestered there in the middle of
looked it
Asia.
up.
Well, you did very well, as usual. The last thing I want to impose upon you is an image of something larger than our course. And I just want to bring it to your attention. See it there. I'm simply making a quick pitch to interested persons to consider this experience. And, it will be on television, so a lot of people, we hope, will tune in and share the experience you've had live with themselves and their families and friends. But this is just one part of a big deal that we're trying to launch. And it involves a number of ambitious projects. I won't go through all of them, but the one I wanted to bring to your attention in particular is a multimedia enterprise on international peace parks. Glacier Waterton International Peace Park was the first ever in the world, 1932. It got started with Rotary clubs, not governments, both sides of the border. They went to their respective governments, Congress and Parliament, in the Depression and got swift action to establish this unique transborder park. Well, now there are efforts on every continent to mimic that in conflict zones. Not North America, is pretty easy in 1930s. But there are proposed peace parks. There's one on the Jordan River. There's one between Kosovo, Albania, and Bosnia. There's one on a glacier between India and Pakistan. There's a peace park idea for Cyprus, where UN peacekeepers have been for 30 years, without resolution. So I want to alert this to you folks to this, and I'm going to try and get support for it because I think we could craft a multimedia revenue-generating project that would focus on endeavors to create peace parks and all the things that go with them. And it's rooted right here in Montana, on our northern border.
It would be interesting to have an international peace park somewhere on the border of the United States and Mexico.
Yes, and actually there is one that's been proposed on the Rio Grande River.
Oh, great.
And, recent years with immigration problems, it hasn't gotten very far. None of these are doing very well. That's one reason to go after them and to publicize these efforts. Most of them are the endeavors of non-governmental organizations and volunteers and citizen groups. I'll finish with this. One of the most interesting places that's been proposed is the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, which has been so effectively established with military forces that it is become a zone of biodiversity of almost unimaginable richness. So conflict zones can be places where life is renewed. So peace parks might help us do that. And with that, I want to thank you and everybody here this evening and everybody that's been here for participating in Global Civics. We hope this is not the end, but just the beginning of a big adventure.
Thanks so much for doing this, Stephen. This is great.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks,
This is
Steve.
terrific. Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
My pleasure.